We're going to get started here in just a minute. So I see a couple more people connecting. All right, let's get started. So a few more people might jump in here as we get going. So thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day. We're going to spend about 20 or 30 minutes, kind of go through the Colonial Pipeline breach, what we know about it, how it happened, what you can learn from it. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please use the chat. Feel free to, I've got my chat window up. So if any questions come up that we can help out and make sure that we answer, I'll definitely try to do that. So one of the things that's come up recently for a lot of our clients is more information from the NCUA as a request to better understand or identify how these large-scale breaches, like the SolarWinds breach, could affect the institution, your credit union. What I'm going to try to do is provide some insight in the latest one, the Colonial Pipeline attack. And then going forward, try to do more of these, because I think I've always said security is 9/10 awareness. And the more that we learn from events like this, hopefully the better that we can secure our own environment. So we're going to go through a little bit about the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lee Bird. I'm the president and owner of Btech. I've been in the industry for 35 years. We've worked exclusively with credit unions for a little over 20 years, 24 years or so. We work with about 100 credit unions across the United States. And our focus, everything we do, there's a layer of security and compliance. We understand, and we have for years, the importance of securing your member information, keeping your credit union environment secure. So events like the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, this really raised my interest over the last 10 days or so because of how this whole event sort of expanded. So let's get into it. So one thing I will say is I've told our clients the events that have occurred over the last 6 months. So going back around December when the SolarWinds supply chain attack event happened. The last 6 months, there have been more events than the previous 6 years combined. It's been unbelievable what's gone on so far this year. The Colonial Pipeline attack, it was a ransomware attack. So we'll talk a little bit about ransom and ransomware and what those types of events are. Why should you care? You should care because your greatest risk as a credit union is ransomware. That I keep telling everybody, there's a lot of threats out there, but ransoms are definitely, the ransomware attacks are definitely the greatest risk. We'll try to have some lessons learned to help you secure your credit union. Let's talk a little bit about Colonial Pipeline. I didn't know who these people were. It's interesting. They founded in '62. They're headquartered out of Alpharetta, Georgia. Just look at that map. That is Colonial Pipeline. They basically, it's one of the largest pipeline operators in the United States. They provide roughly 45% of the East Coast fuel. So this is gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. That pipeline is major infrastructure. That's a word that we're hearing in politics every day now. But it's one of the major infrastructure components of the United States of how we operate, especially as it relates to fuel on the whole Eastern Seaboard. I'm going to take a quick little sidebar. We've seen a lot more infrastructure attacks. One that you may or may not have heard of was in Florida back in February. A water treatment facility was breached, and they were releasing large amounts of chemicals into the water supply. And this is drinking water. So it was detected and they were able to stop it, but you can see how this could really be extremely dangerous. Obviously, this Colonial Pipeline ransom attack forced them to shut operations down. And we know what happened then. But imagine if your water supply was tainted with a chemical or something. So this is very scary stuff. The attack. Okay, so let's go right into this. On May 8th, Colonial Pipeline announced that they were the victim of a cybersecurity attack. That's the term they used. The attack occurred on May 7th, and immediately they stopped operations. They shut their systems down. We learned pretty quickly who this was. Colonial Pipeline first reported the attack to the FBI. One of my favorite groups is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, Security Agency, CISA, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. They were not notified by Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline is a private company, so currently there's no requirement for them to report this to an agency like CISA. They brought in the FBI because of the ransom request. The FBI quickly reported it to CISA. Interestingly enough, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, President Biden did issue an executive order last Wednesday, and one of the first parts of this executive order is the disclosure of these types of events from private industry to the government. So this will be interesting to see how this all shakes out. So the hacking group DarkSide claims responsibility. And within a couple of days, they issued an apology. This is the attacker issuing an apology. They really just wanted the ransom. They did not expect that Colonial Pipeline would shut down operations and cause this gas shortage on the whole eastern seaboard. And we've learned more about DarkSide, and I'll speak a little bit about who these people are, but sort of interesting how that all happened. Interestingly enough, also, it was not the when I first heard about Colonial Pipeline shutting down operations, I imagined computers that controlled valves or the release of gasoline and things like that. It was actually their billing system that was encrypted. So a lot of the experts said the Colonial Pipeline could have allowed the gasoline and the fuel to continue running in this pipeline, but they wouldn't have had any way to bill for it or to control the amount of fuel that was being released or understand who got the fuel. So that's why they did shut down the operations. And on May 13th, it was disclosed that Colonial Pipeline, in fact, did pay the ransom. They paid $5 million. They paid it on May 7th. So if you look at the timeline, for a period of about 6 or 7 days, most of the experts were thinking, what's going to happen here? Are they going to pay the ransom? Or are they negotiating? Because that's a tactic as well. These attackers will negotiate. I've seen some threads with actual screenshots of what these negotiations look like. But it turns out that really, if you look at the timeline, the day that this event occurred, Colonial Pipeline paid the ransom. So I've also seen, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, different business leaders, CEOs, they basically have already gone through this playbook and they know, yes, they're going to pay the ransom or no, they're not. For a business like Colonial Pipeline, a $5 million ransom is as much money as that is. That's nothing compared to their operations. So they already knew if this ever happened to them, they were going to pay the ransom. We know that because they paid it the same day that the event occurred. Who's DarkSide? Right? So this is interesting. There's a little twist here to the plot. I'm not really a movie guy, but I do like these sort of mysteries, and learning more and more about DarkSide and this whole event, how it happened, is pretty incredible. It's stuff Hollywood couldn't make up. So DarkSide, these are organized hackers based out of Russia. We know they're out of Russia. They're not part of the Russian government agency, though. That's a separate group that has carried out attacks against the United States, including the SolarWinds breach. But one of the things we've learned about DarkSide is they have an ethical policy. They won't attack nonprofits. They won't attack hospitals or healthcare institutions. They also are what's called a ransomware as a service. They basically have a platform, and bad guys around the world can use their platform to attack other businesses. So if I use the DarkSide platform to attack someone and get a ransom, I have to pay a commission or a portion of that ransom to DarkSide. DarkSide was in operations for about 6 months. And during that time, we know of at least $90 million in Bitcoin that they took in. So pretty crazy when you kind of look at the scope here. In 6 months, making $90 million, that's pretty incredible. Here's the twist to the whole plot. So we first heard from DarkSide. They issued an apology. They did not expect that Colonial Pipeline would have shut the operations down, and that the government, the US government, would have gotten involved. They did. President Biden did actually, or I guess it was part of Biden's cabinet, did actually reach out to Russia and say, is this a state-sponsored attack? Somebody must have reported this to DarkSide because they were embarrassed by this. They did issue that apology. Interesting through this whole thing as well, DarkSide issued a statement that their systems had been taken offline and that their $5 million ransom that they had collected from Colonial Pipeline was gone. So somebody stole their Bitcoin. DarkSide's out of business as of today. So this leads to another side story, which is everybody's trying to figure out who attacked DarkSide. I immediately thought it's got to be the US intelligence. We must have had people that knew who DarkSide was and knew where their systems were and how to go after them. But I wonder if it could have been another attacker attacking an attacker. I don't know. I mean, this is, again, it's more than Hollywood could script. But that's who this group was, DarkSide. So we asked the question why, and I know one of the questions that most of my clients have asked me is, how did Colonial Pipeline get infected? So we do know that they are currently using a private company called FireEye. You may remember them from the SolarWinds breach. FireEye is currently doing an investigation. I would imagine by now, 11 days into this, they know how they were infected. It hasn't been disclosed yet, and it may not be because, again, it's a private company. So the question that I get asked a lot is, how did they get infected? We don't know. Why? So the first question is, would you pay? The latest attacks are basically what's called a double extortion. So they demand a ransom for an encryption key, and this is to get your systems back. So when they infect your environment, they're locking down your workstations, your servers, all of your computers. So you pay a ransom to basically get those systems back. The other thing, this double extortion, what they're doing now as well, these ransom attacks, this is all kind of new, is in the process of infecting your systems, they're stealing your data. So they'll steal as much data as they can, and then you have to pay a ransom to either get your data back or for a promise for them to not release it on the dark web. So that's the double extortion. Do you want your systems back? And then B, in the case of a credit union, we've got all your member information. So you have to pay us a ransom to get your systems back online. You've also got to pay us a ransom, otherwise we're going to release all of your member information on the dark web. The targeted industries, obviously infrastructure is huge, small government, financial institutions, and infrastructure. Ransomware is up 500% in 2020. I think like pre-COVID, I kind of thought ransomware was sort of on a decline. I didn't really expect that it would be this growing industry, but obviously it is. Ransomware is typically paid in Bitcoin. It's hard to track the attackers. Bitcoin does have a signature. You do know where that exchange ends up going, and a lot of it ends up in what they call flat currency. So eventually they turn that Bitcoin into cash. Colonial Pipeline had a $15 million cyber insurance policy. So again, they were prepared for this. I suspect that they contacted their insurance carrier. They probably had an incident response plan. They already knew if they could get the ransom negotiated to something that the insurance would cover, that they were going to do that. In researching this, the average ransom is $312,000. That's an insane number. So $5 million seems like a lot. $312,000 seems like a lot to me. So these are the facts. This is what we know about these ransomware attacks. So a couple of interesting things happened as Colonial Pipeline got back in operations. The first was, this was not a perfect tool that DarkSide had created. In fact, the encrypting key, the decrypting key that was used to try to get the systems restored was so slow that Colonial Pipeline had to restore most of their files from backups. Okay, so we talk about backups with our clients every conversation we have. Most operations were restored by the 13th, and as of today, they did send out a tweet that they're back to full operations. But I also learned gasoline only travels 5 miles an hour in a pipeline. So when you try to get gas back across the eastern seaboard, it's going to take a while. We're going to touch base on this backups a little bit more. This is interesting. So I mentioned FireEye. So this is one of the world's largest cybersecurity businesses. And in prior investigations of 5 DarkSide groups, so these are these ransomware as a service, these are the attackers that are using the DarkSide platform. So in prior investigations, here's what we learned. There's a group called UNC 2628, and they did a ransom attack within the last 6 months. Their attack, they compromised credentials and used them to VPN into the environment. Okay, so we've talked about compromised credentials in the past. So they knew a user's VPN account, and they were able to get access into the environment that way. So that's the first way. The second group, UNC 2659, again, these are DarkSide attackers. On their attack, they exploited a known vulnerability. It was the SonicWall SMA vulnerability. So we alerted our clients to this vulnerability back in January. But if this vulnerability was not patched in your environment, this was a method that this UNC 2659 group was using to gain access into your environment. So see, they're all doing it a little bit differently. The third one, this is the one you probably would have guessed. UNC 2465, they sent out phishing emails. So we know what phishing is. And this, again, continues to grow. Your greatest risk is ransomware. 96% of ransomware comes from clicking on a link in an email. That's phishing. In the case of UNC 2465, they laid dormant for 45 days between the time that they had access to the environment and the time that they turned on the ransom. So in that 45 days, they were collecting, stealing your data. And this, again, is part of that double extortion attempt. The other thing is, I mentioned backups. What if your systems had been infected for 45 days? Do you have backups that are older than 45 days that you could go back to restore your systems if you had to? It's good to kind of think about all this. Okay, so what should you do? The first thing is you have to train your staff. This conversation that we're having today, I appreciate everyone being on this call. This is it's a reminder. We always have to be thinking about events like this. Your staff is probably your greatest risk. Again, we have great security. We can set up firewalls and we can use vendors to help us monitor the systems and do all of these things. But if someone gets an email that says, please read this attachment, or I need you to go to this website to update your Amazon delivery address, right? All of these types of phishing attacks, boom, that's how they infect your systems. Multi-factor authentication, MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. The one attacker, DarkSide group, used these VPN credentials. If your VPN is protected not just by your username and password, but also by multi-factor authentication, MFA isn't perfect, but again, having multiple layers of authentication really, really reduces your overall risk, especially of being attackers in a case like this using compromised credentials. Backups, okay? Multiple point-in-time backups. So replication is not a backup. We need our data protected. We need daily, weekly, monthly, and annual copies of our data. Critical systems like database that probably should be protected multiple times throughout the day. And here's a term you're going to hear more and more. I've heard this, I don't know if it's a word or a phrase, air gap. I've heard this more in the last week than I did in the previous 10 years. Air gap is segregating your data from the environment. Because if your backups are on the same systems that the ransomware attacks, guess what? Your backups are infected as well. So air gapping is the ability of physically separating how your data is residing in your environment. Some of our clients are even looking at implementing tape drives again. We haven't seen tape drives in environments, and I don't ever want to see them again because they're horrible. But looking at a way to take their encrypted data backups that typically sit like on a Windows server or a vault, and getting those physically off of it into some other media. So that's air gap. Incident response plan. So I would ask you the question, who are you going to call if and when you have a ransom event? And I would strongly suggest learning from events like this. You're at risk of a ransomware attack. And I know a lot of you would probably call me, that's fine. But do you have an incident response plan? And do you know what you're going to do, who you're going to call? And what I think also, really, you probably should have a plan with your attorney and your board. Are we going to pay the ransom? Because if you are, you have to have tactics to negotiate. You need to have a plan in that regards. Cyber insurance. So do you have cyber insurance? And again, conversation with your carrier. Do we pay the ransom or not? And if we do pay the ransom, how do we pay it? How do we get the Bitcoin? Who's going to do this process for us? So, all right, I had a question. This is a good one. Can Btech help with the incident response plan? Yes, we can. So we don't write incident response plans, but we can work with we have a vendor that we can refer you to that does these. And a lot of your environment actually goes into that incident response plan. So details about your environment, and we can help you out with all that. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here in a couple minutes. A couple of resources that I want you all, so I'll send this slide deck out to everyone that attended today's webinar. There's a CISA alert, and this is basically a general directive on ransomware. And it's a good document to probably print out and share with some management and make sure that everybody's on board, that at least there's an awareness of what a ransom attack is. Obviously, my favorite resource for cyber events is CISA, us-cert.gov. Great resource. Sign up for their email alerts. ZDNet.com was a great resource. That website is sort of computer-based technology, but they had updates multiple times throughout the day. So they were kind of monitoring this event as it sort of mushroomed, and we we learn more and more facts. Obviously, Wall Street Journal has some great stuff as well. I would say sort of the takeaway from this also is going to be President Biden's executive order. So that is going to make news. I do believe personally that we need more of a cyber strategy at the federal level. We'll see what happens with this. But one of the things that was in this executive order, I mentioned the communication of private industry to the government about events. There's also the executive order mandates deployment of multi-factor authentication and encryption. It's like the second or third item. So these things are going to be probably regulated at some point pretty soon. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes to open this up to questions. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat message. Again, I'm really thankful that we had a good group on today's call. I'm going to try to do these calls as these types of events come up. If there's any specific questions you have about what we went over today, feel free to email me. As I mentioned also, to all the attendees, I'm gonna take this PowerPoint deck and send it to you. I would also suggest that just as a matter of practice internally, it's probably a good idea to document events like this and share this information with management, the CEO, your board. They probably should know that you're paying attention to events like the Colonial Pipeline. The other thing is, would any of your board members come up to you in a board meeting and say, hey, what do you know about that Colonial Pipeline breach? In a case of this, because it did make all the national news, I would absolutely say yes, they would know about this. So being prepared and understanding what a ransomware attack is, this is important for you. So have a few more, some thank yous. So nice messages here. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. There also will be a recording, so I'll try to post that as well in case you want to share it with anyone. But I promise to keep this to 30 minutes. I know sometimes I tend to keep going on, but we're here at 30 minutes. So thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day. And if I can help with anything, answer any questions, please email me or give me a call. Okay? Thank you very much. Take care.